Okay, everyone, we are now recording, I believe. Yes. So welcome, everyone. This is Joyce Davis. I'm PennLive's Outreach and Opinion Editor, and we have yet another editorial board meeting that we will make available to our readers. And this one, again, is all of them are important topics, but this one I think is especially dear to our hearts since it does involve children, and especially children behind bars. The Prison Policy Initiative sent a press release out letting us know that they had a new report out, Youth Confinement, the Whole Pie 2025. And apparently this report, really goes into some detail to show how many youths are confined away from home on any given day. It breaks down the type of facilities they're held in and for what offenses. And it also kind of tells us, it gives us a table of youth confined by state and offense type. But we are really particularly concerned about this issue here in Pennsylvania because, I mean, as I was telling them before we came on, I remember having many, many discussions over this a few years back when Governor Wolf ordered a 1 year study of youth incarceration in Pennsylvania, and the report was scathing. It came back and just simply said, yeah, racism is involved. Yes, kids are not being treated well. Yes, the facility. I mean, it was just shocking. And there seemed to be a consensus, not a bipartisan consensus, that something needed to be done. And so one of the things, since they have their eyes on this all the time, that I'd like to ask Wanda Bertram and her guest, Brian Nam Sonnenstein, who I think did the report, just what happened to that, if they know anything about it, has anything changed? So, but before we do, I'll let you know we do have members of our editorial board here. We have Rajette Harris, we have Gloria Merrick, and we have Reverend Sandy Strauss. We will likely get some others to join us, but we'll get started now. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Wanda, with the Prison Policy Initiative.
Well, Joyce and everyone on the board, we really appreciate being able to talk to you today. So thank you very much for having us. If for anyone who's not familiar with our organization, we are a group that uses research and data to raise awareness and expose the broader harms of mass criminalization. This report is kind of unusual for us. We usually focus on the adult criminal legal system. The report itself is a riff on a report we do every single year called Mass Incarceration, the Whole Pie, which breaks down how many people are locked up in the U.S., what types of facilities they're held in, what offenses they're there for. But we did think it's important to put a spotlight on youth incarceration, partly because it is so important to adult incarceration, right? Over 1 in 3 adults in state prisons was first arrested before the age of 16. So what states are doing with kids, how states are handling crime or disorder that involves youth is very, very tied into the trajectories of people's lives later on. That's why we did this report. Now, and we also wanted to highlight some of the persistent injustices in the youth incarceration system that mirror what we see in the adult system. Things like racial disparities, which, as we can talk about more, are getting worse in the youth system, high rates of pretrial detention, and stubbornly high rates of incarceration for very low-level things like technical violations of one's supervision. What we did in this report, which Brian can go into more because he wrote it, is we aggregated data from all different types and parts of the youth justice system nationwide to put together this comprehensive picture. We also, for the first time doing this report, aggregated data about every single state into this table that Joyce mentioned, where you can see every single state's incarceration of youth for what types of offenses and then in what kinds of placement these youth are in. I'll go into this in a bit. We identified some states like Pennsylvania that stand out for incarcerating youth at high rates overall relative to others, and also that incarcerate kids often for low-level offenses. Um, I know I know Pennsylvania convened a task force under Governor Wolf that was meant to address the persistent issues in the juvenile legal system, and I'm aware that that group issued a report that had 35 or so recommendations for ways to fix the juvenile legal system in Pennsylvania. And to my knowledge, although there might be more recent updates than this that I don't know about, but to my knowledge, the Pennsylvania legislature has only ever acted on a couple of those 30 plus reform suggestions, and I actually don't know which ones those are. So this is a this I've read that document a couple times. It is like Joyce said, a stunning indictment of the juvenile legal system in Pennsylvania, and it's extremely detailed and precise in its recommendations for what the state can do to shrink its system. Um, so I know that we're retreading old ground a little bit here, because for those of you that are already familiar with that report and are familiar with the system, but hopefully the slightly newer data that we have will help lend some urgency to this issue again. Um, so with that, I think I will highlight some of the things that we found in Pennsylvania that stuck out to us in particular. Um, so I'll start by saying that you can compare Pennsylvania to other states with comparable populations, and you can see states that are making a conscious choice to not incarcerate youth at such high rates. Illinois has actually a couple 100,000 more youth in its population than Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, Pennsylvania locks up almost twice as many youth on any given day as Illinois does. Of course, you compare Pennsylvania with a state like Ohio, and there is just as much, if not more, incarceration. So it's not like all of Pennsylvania's peers or neighbors are some of them incarcerate more kids, some of them less. But it is striking that there are states that are doing that are making this concerted effort to reduce youth incarceration. Pennsylvania also stands out for continuing to incarcerate kids for some of the lowest level offenses. It is, along with Alabama and Indiana, a state that is comprising about 30% of kids confined nationwide for what are called status offenses. A status offense is a behavior that is not a law violation for adults. Things like running away, truancy. In particular, in Pennsylvania, you have about 33 kids confined on any given day for underage drinking. The other nationwide leader on this type of incarceration is West Virginia. You've got almost 70 kids on any given day confined for something called incorrigibility, which has to do with just persistent rule breaking or refusing to follow rules at home. These are not crimes for adults. They are behaviors that other states can and do deal with community services, right? And services that are promulgated by schools, by community groups, right? Not by incarcerating children. But Pennsylvania continues to do this. Um, Pennsylvania also locks up almost 200 kids on any given day for technical violations of supervision. This is one of the issues that, as I mentioned, we're trying to highlight issues that are mirrored in the adult and the youth systems, and this is one. Incarceration for technical violations of supervision is something that drives prison populations in the adult system, even though a technical violation is a non-criminal violation of one's probation or parole. I recall reading in the task force report that Governor Wolf commissioned that there were a lot of kids that were being funneled into youth prisons for non-payment of fines and fees. So kids who have already been pulled into the system, who simply need to, that they haven't, a court has not found them to be a risk to safety, but they are failing to pay a fee that they incurred because of their involvement with the system, and for that they are incarcerated. These are the types of things that in our world, the kind of criminal legal system reform world, we call low-hanging fruit. They're reforms that we frankly are very used to, arguing. They're how can I say this? They're reforms that many states have already taken action on, and they are so obvious that we have already moved on to arguing for what many people consider to be more radical reform, right? Decarceration of kids and adults, even incarcerated for more serious offenses. These are the things that we, to put it one way, are surprised that we still have to even argue about. And but that's, that doesn't make them any less important to talk about today. And I think also highlights the importance of implementing the reforms that in Pennsylvania experts have already said this is very important. So I feel like I've talked enough for the outset. If Joyce, if you'd like to moderate any questions for us.
Well, I'd like to hear from Brian since he did the report and maybe just a little context over how this came about, how long it took, that kind of thing.
You're talking about the writing of the report?
Yes.
Yes. As Wanda mentioned, this is a report that we do periodically. It's not one that we do every single year like we do the whole pie for the adult criminal legal system. I think the last one we did was just before the pandemic in 2019, looking at data in 2017. We had let a few years go by, and obviously the data, as it is in the adult system and with a lot of other things, it's kind of a little bit all over the place because of COVID, because of the delays that it introduced to the system, and then the system catching up as sort of it went back to business as usual. But we were able to, by looking at data from 2023 and comparing it back to data from 2017, we were able to get a good look at how things have changed since then. This report came together over the span of a couple months. Like I said, we had done it relatively recently, so we had a bit of a template to work from. We also did add some new things, like you mentioned, the state data. We also wrote a little bit about youth probation, which ties into what Wanda was saying about the overwhelming use of technical violations as a reason to lock up and incarcerate kids. So yeah, those are some of the things that went into the report. I did it with my colleague Wendy Sawyer at PPI, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any specific questions you might have about it.
Well, the first question that I would have about it is I heard that Wanda also suggests that things are not getting better on the racism front. I mean, that's, and so could you talk about that a little bit? Because that was one of the things that, even I, trying to be conciliatory, was this, well, maybe I'm sure it's the same for all people who have no money, and they said, no, racism. So would you talk, why is that worse? I mean, maybe you don't know why, but
Wanda, you want me to take that?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, if you feel comfortable.
Sure, yeah. I think the easiest answer to this question is that what we see reflected in the numbers for the youth system is a reflection of policing and not offending. Kids of different racial backgrounds offend more or less at the same rates. What we're seeing instead is how those different racial and ethnic groups are policed, as well as how those cases are then handled and treated by the system. So Black and brown kids, by and large, are policed more often and more harshly than white children are. Their communities are more often surveilled. They're sort of brought into the system earlier than white children are. And then once they're in the system, one of the things that we notice is particularly in the juvenile system, cases are handled either formally or informally. Formally means they go before a judge and they're adjudicated in a formal manner. Informally is more about handling things before they go to court, often leads to less harsh punishments and things like that. And there are very, very pronounced racial disparities in how those cases are handled. Black children are far more likely to have their cases formally disposed of, which means that they often end up with harsher punishments and then end up in the system and for longer periods of time and things like that. What we're seeing is that while nationwide there's been incredible progress made in decarceration, as those numbers are going down, the kids who are left behind are more often Black and brown children. In a separate report, we talk about how neurodivergent kids with disabilities are also being left behind and becoming a greater share of a smaller population of confined youth. So yeah, I hope that gives a sense of sort of how it ends up this way. It's not a reflection of sort of a propensity to law breaking among specific racial groups. This is a reflection of policing and court practices.
Got it.
And I'll just add on. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just add on one thing to highlight something you said, Brian, which is that kids, once they're in the system treats Black kids differently. Something that struck me reading the report was the higher rates of pretrial detention for Black children and Indigenous children as compared to white kids. And this is one of the other things that, again, mirrors the adult criminal legal system is high rates of pretrial detention. In Pennsylvania, you've got about 350 kids who are, excuse me, you have, about 1,100 kids who are incarcerated overall. You've got about 750 who are committed, so their cases have been adjudicated, and then you've got almost 350 who are held pretrial. This is more or less how it breaks down in the adult system too. Like a decent share, somewhere between a third and half of adults incarcerated are there before they've even been tried. And this is something, again, that the task force or maybe I could use a different term for this, but the experts that were convened by Governor Wolf remarked on that pretrial detention should be extremely focused, and it should not be something that courts are doing and imposing on kids as a default. But we can see that, very clearly, even for nonviolent, low-level offenses, there are kids who are being put behind bars. Their schooling is being interrupted. They've been being taken away from their families and other social supports before they've even been tried. And I think that's one of those other kind of low-hanging fruit type reforms. It's right there. Sandra, I see you have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Reverend Sandy.
Yes. My question is, do you have data on how youth incarceration may affect the potential for further incarceration once they become adults? In other words, does it contribute to behaviors that may then cause them to be incarcerated once they have reached adulthood?
Mm-hmm. Brian might be able to put a finer point on this than I can, but I think that to a certain extent, that the proof is in what we know about the adult system. Because, as I said before, 1 in 3 adults in state prison was first locked up before they were 16 years old. An even higher number, I think around 60%, were incarcerated for the first time before they were 18. So we know that there is a trajectory, right, that many people are on that includes first incarceration as youth, and then later, presumably cycling through the system as they graduate into adulthood. We also know, and this is something I had hoped to bring up on this call, that there are many analyses that show that confining kids away from home is not something that improves recidivism rates. Compared to community-based treatment, compared to community supervision options, right? Kids who are locked up do not show, there is no evidence that improves recidivism. And I should say recidivism is not a metric that we lean on to talk about, success in a person's life, that, you'd have to look more broadly at, did they get educated? Did they get a job? But what recidivism does show is how often is that person involved with the system again after they've been incarcerated. And I think what the meta-analyses will tell us is that kids who are locked up are involved with the system again and again and again at rates that are just as high, if not higher, than kids that are not confined away from home. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you did a great job to sort of add on to some of the statistics you were talking about in the beginning. I think we had in the report that 7 out of every 10 adults in state prison were first arrested before the age of 19. So I think youth incarceration is a very strong predictor of later adult incarceration. And I think that there's kind of straightforward ways to understand why this is the case. Incarceration at any age, but particularly for a child, is extremely traumatic. It's very disruptive to their lives. Kids, particularly in the more restrictive lockups and larger lockups, often experience sexual violence. They don't have real meaningful opportunities at education. Their mental health needs are not taken care of. And I also think on another level that if you're sort of introduced into the system, particularly at a young age, it tells you something about your relationship to the world and your relationship to authority and government in your community that I think, you know, like Wanda was talking about, it doesn't really have a positive impact on keeping kids out of the system. These are profoundly, like I said, traumatic and disruptive experiences that only, I think, you know, it can be reasonably said, make it more likely that kids will go down this path. And again, you know, it's not even just about behavior. Once you're in the system, you know, you are there's all kinds of trap doors to pull you back in if you're on probation or anything like that. You know, we've been talking about technical violations. It's hard to get out once you're pulled in.
Yeah. There is one issue here that for me, and I think for many of our readers is particularly concerning, if not absolutely heartbreaking, is the fact that some of these are clearly poor children from families, and some of these things involve fines. How can they be expected? How can a child be expected to come up to pay a fine, especially if their family is poor and can't pay it? So the child it seems to have no recourse, and no compassion. So one of the questions I have, are there in other states, is there a solution to this? Because I could see there being some sort of fund that would be set aside that we would happily contribute to pay these fines. And I assume many of these fines are not millions of dollars, right? They could be a few $100s, right? Would you
Right.
address that?
Yes. First I'll say that, well, one of the things we know about fines and fees in the justice system is that they it's not particularly profitable to recover them. It's not like the criminal justice system. I mean, I think there are places where the court system runs on fine and fee revenue. But overall, my impression is that it's so expensive to recover fines from people that it's barely worth it from a cost perspective, right? If the state is trying to save money by imposing costs on people who are system involved, it's just not working very well because of all the overhead that is required to remind people, et cetera, et cetera. And again, and like you said, like you intuited, Joyce, these are not extremely high amounts. It's probably $100 to $1,000 for most people. Brian, this is kind of a Hail Mary to you, but I I think I heard about California eliminating juvenile probation fees. Does that ring a bell for you?
You know, this wasn't really part of the report, so I'm not sure if I really remember too much about fines and fees. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I can speak to that.
That's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
What I have heard about is other states taking action to address fines and fees. There is another organization called the Fines and Fees Justice Center, wonderful organization where this is their entire charter, reducing unnecessary fines in the system. I'll also say, so I know that states have taken some action on it. Like Brian, I can't really elaborate on what the changes have been, but I'll say that there's also rather than finding some way of lessening the burden of the fines, right? Like providing people with payment plans or starting a fund or giving people, access to lawyers so that they can fight reincarceration for non-payment. It would be just as well, and I think this is what most states that have reformed this have chosen to do, to just wipe the fines out entirely, right? This is especially it becomes when you look at what the fines are actually for, you start to feel more emotional. I think it takes on more emotional resonance. Knowing, for example, that kids and adults have to pay fines for public defenders, that people are often being charged fines for wearing an ankle monitor, which is technology that the companies that make these monitors are profiting hugely off of every single year, right? Profiting at the expense of kids and adults who might be paying on the order of $10 a day for the privilege of wearing an ankle monitor, right?
Oh.
people not paying fines, having fines associated actually with incarceration. I don't know if this is an issue in the juvenile system, but in the adult system, there are what we call pay to stay fees, which are basically you're paying room and board for being incarcerated. And so, I think that the fees and fines themselves have actually been constructed as a way to punish people. That's so it kind of makes it make sense that people are, end up incarcerated for non-payment. It's seen as some kind of sign that you're not serious about rehabilitation. But I think we need to recognize, as you pointed out, Joyce, that an overwhelming number of people in the system come from low-income backgrounds, and burdening them with a financial, costs like this is not going to put them on any better footing for improving their life course.
Absolutely. Gloria, go ahead. You were next.
I think you're getting at this. I was looking, what do you find are the biggest deterrents to this issue, to having this be an issue? What are you recommending? What are you looking for Pennsylvania to do more specifically? Like, where would you like them to stop or to start? To get to this issue, to do something differently. So I heard a lot of it. I think this great information. Kudos to you for researching this. I'm with the Latino Center here. I hear everything you're saying, and I would echo it. But I'd like to hear more about, like, what are you looking for Pennsylvania to do? What do you find works more specifically? I think you were starting to get at that a little bit, but if there were 3 or 4 things that Pennsylvania could do, what are you looking for? What solutions would you like to see?
Yeah, well, I'd like to highlight some solutions that have been tried in other places, either the adult or the youth system. One of them is removing status offenses from court jurisdiction. So status offenses are those things: incorrigibility, truancy, underage drinking, running away, that I mentioned earlier. There are states, Massachusetts is one, Utah is another, oddly enough, that have said we are not going to these behaviors may be rule violations for kids. We are not going to prosecute these. We're not going to treat them within the juvenile court system at all. And this is something that was actually recommended in the report that Governor Wolf commissioned as well. That's something I mentioned this because it's been done somewhere else, and it would immediately, like low-hanging fruit, like we were talking about before, this would address a significant chunk of the Pennsylvania incarcerated youth population. I would also urge the state to end incarceration for technical violations of supervision, whether as pretrial detention or as, a punishment for kids that have been found guilty of a technical violation. Those are some, those are maybe the easier reforms that, if this was, the board of newspaper in Ohio, I might stop there, recognizing that there are political kind of divides that are entrenched and make some of these reforms hard to do. But there is much more that can be done besides that. There's an organization called Care Not Control, who I know this board has spoken with before, who have argued for a moratorium on the building of new correctional facilities for youth in Pennsylvania. I completely agree with that. I think typically what we see is that when a new facility is opened, it's because of perceived capacity issues with another facility, overcrowding, right, or understaffing relative to the population. But in basically every state, there are measures that could be taken to decarcerate, to deal with capacity issues through decarceration rather than opening new facilities. This is something that I don't know of any states that have necessarily passed moratoriums on new youth facilities, but Massachusetts, I think, passed a moratorium on building new jails, particularly for women, a few years ago. This was in response to the state was trying to build a new women's jail. There was a big push against it, including from women who were justice involved, who said the problem is not that the jail is not good enough. The problem is that we are over incarcerating people. So legislatures can do this, right? They can say we are not going to build any more new capacity for the system, at least until certain pervasive issues have been solved. So I guess those are things that I would highlight. I feel a little bit like upstaged by this wonderful report that came out several years ago, but I do think that like Joy said at the top, these were, at the time that that report was done, this was an issue that garnered a lot of bipartisan support. Obviously, we're living through a time when, with what's coming out of the White House is fear mongering about kids and youth crime, particularly about Black kids, extremely, in my opinion, racist proposals to lock up kids, more kids as adults. But states don't have to follow what the White House is doing, right? They can go in a different direction. So that's, I guess, those are the few things that I would highlight. Brian, is there anything else that comes to mind for you?
No, I mean, I think that you're right to point those out. They are the most obtainable. The only thing that I would add is that there are a variety of other recommendations that revolve around the idea that we should be trying to keep kids at home and in their communities as much as, to the extent possible. Those options should be completely exhausted before any other actions are taken. We have to reckon with the fact that a lot of community spaces, a lot of constructive spaces, if they existed in the first place, have been wiped out of a lot of these communities. The communities hardest hit by youth policing and youth incarceration. So creating more community programs, health and education, public health and education programs in communities that keep kids in their homes and in their neighborhoods. Those are the other sorts of things that I would contribute.
Mm-hmm. And I think to tag on to that, it was either Baltimore or the state of Maryland that recently made a really big investment in summer programs for young people. So making sure that summertime is it's a time when crime rates tend to be higher overall. Kids are not occupied in the same way. Again, if we're talking more about low income kids, families that can't afford to send kids to summer camp. So states developing, summer programs for youth, especially programs that can help get kids on track to get jobs, I think is a really sensible way of not just trying to attack this problem as an incarceration problem, but actually as a community safety and well-being issue, right? Investing in the communities that have been hit hardest by incarceration. At the risk of belaboring all of this, I will just say that diversion programs, which were one of the key things that the Pennsylvania report was recommending more of, those can happen at any stage of involvement with the criminal legal process. It can be after a kid is arrested, when their case is just beginning. It can be something that prosecutors provide as an option. So to avoid a criminal conviction, kids can pursue a diversion program. Probation is also a form of diversion. We have a whole report on this as well, like the different types of diversion programs that states and counties have implemented and so there are a wealth of options.
Yep. Okay, Rosette, you have your hand up.
Yes, I was wondering if you had a position on police officers in schools. I know that's a controversial issue. So I wanted to bring up that topic.
Yeah. Our organization, this is a little bit of a tricky one because we don't deal as much with police as we do just with incarceration overall. I would say police officers in schools don't, I mean, I think that what's very concerning about them is that you see that officers are in the aggregate arresting Black youth at higher rates, punishing Black youth at higher rates. Same goes for youth with disabilities. I think somewhere between a third and a half of kids who are arrested in schools nationwide have some kind of intellectual disability. So I mean, I would say I know that, we're living through a time when school safety is paramount for a lot of people, but I think that again, this is kind of, it gets back to questions of what resources are we choosing to invest in historically under-resourced communities, right? Are we spending more on improving reducing classroom sizes, improving teacher pay, expanding after-school programs for kids, again, summer programs, or are we spending that money, and states have limited resources, right? Are we spending that money on more cops in schools? So I would say that, it's in a vacuum where we can say you can have any new resources that you want. I think there's a bunch of different options that are on the table, but when we're realistically talking about a limited number of resources, I think it's it's better from a racial justice perspective, from an economic justice perspective, to invest that money in improving the quality of schools, not more police.
Mhm. Well, as we close here, I think you've laid a lot on the table, but one of the key things wouldn't you recommend that they simply stop finding kids? They can't pay.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, that is another reform that I think is so obvious that it could, it's stunning that hasn't already been passed, right? Uh, and I think also, recognizing that financial inequity and poverty are at the root of a lot of disorder. Looking at that and seeing that as a reason to invest more in opportunities for youth, and yes, of course, to wipe out those fees.
Right. Now, go ahead, Reverend Strauss.
Yes, I actually wanted to ask a question on that point of other programs, because I'm wondering if the argument can be made for this kind of programming for kids to keep them out of prison, or put them into diversion programs, because it's my understanding that those programs are also a lot less expensive than incarceration is.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
I'm wondering if that is an argument that would have any merit with our legislators.
I mean, I definitely think so. This is a data point I found from Care Not Control, but that Pennsylvania spends over $200,000 per kid per year. When you lock up a kid, it's extremely expensive. By comparison, the state spends $16,000 per kid per year to educate through education in the public schools. Right? So if this is about budget choices, there is some. The legislature could start from a perspective of we actually want to reallocate that 200 grand every year per kid, and if we're going to reallocate it, how will we do it? Right? There are so many different programs available, and like you said, I think these programs tend to cost a lot less because they are in the community. I think that's one of the things I see as like a major win-win of non-carceral solutions, is that they are both the fact that they're delivered through the community actually does make them cheaper. So yeah, I don't know of research specifically showing benefits as far as recidivism rates associated with those programs. That's something I could look up and send to you guys, though.
Yeah, it would, if you have any information too on what states have done away with the fines thing, that would be helpful as well.
Absolutely.
The reason I'm focusing on that is because we did just have some improvement at the Dauphin County Prison of having people incarcerated there, fines removed and fees removed. So there might be an understanding that this is doable. It's been done at one prison for them. Maybe it could be doable for young people. And I guess if nobody has any other questions, I don't know if you've dealt at all with this issue of youth in adult prisons. If that has been the subject of any portion of your report.
Let's see. Oh, okay. I think we lost Brian for a second.
He's there.
I think
Oh,
I'm
nope.
here, but my screen might be frozen. But
Okay.
I can hear you.
Do you want to speak to the incarceration of youth as adults?
Yeah, definitely. This is again another area where we see pronounced racial disparities. Black kids are far more often transferred, is the term that's used in the juvenile system, to have their cases transferred to the adult system. There have been some efforts in recent years to try to curtail this by campaigns known as like raise the age laws, to sort of like raise the age at which people can be transferred. But again, as you might imagine, this is a profoundly harmful and traumatizing experience for youth. Again, not only subjecting them to very restrictive and punitive environments, but environments in which they are vulnerable to sexual assault, to long periods of time in isolation, particularly in the adult setting, because you have so few youth in prisons compared to compared to adults, they have to be segregated from the adult population. You're essentially talking about long-term isolation, in one form or another for kids. So yeah, this is I don't know if there are more specific questions about the transfer of youth to the adult system, but for sure this is another area where frankly, it just needs to stop. There's not really a way to make it any better. It's just not something that should happen, period.
I will say too that the Pennsylvania report had a number of recommendations about this, including raising the age at which a youth may be transferred to criminal court to 16, ending certain carve-outs that basically allowed the state to escape having to provide a burden of proof that this was important if the case, for instance, involved a deadly weapon. And then eliminating what's called direct file, which is basically a way that prosecutors can expedite the process of transferring a kid to adult court. People who frankly know more about the youth justice system in Pennsylvania than we do have already made some pretty sophisticated recommendations about this. And the Pennsylvania legislature just needs to act. I have to say, I don't envy you guys picking out something to recommend in your column, because there is so much to talk about here.
Well, considering we still don't have a state budget, and it's how many months past, we have a little bit of a problem getting our legislature to act.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we should stop trying, and that is why we wanted to call you in, because this at least provides an impetus for us to say things need to be done, and they need to be done now. We've waited long enough for these kinds of small changes, and we may be able to get some support from our officials to move these things along. But I just want to thank you both for taking the time to explain this and to let us know just how poorly Pennsylvania is doing in taking care of its children. It's not a very pleasant report. It is an indictment of us as a Commonwealth. So if no one else has any other questions, we will leave it at that. And I think you know the nature of the editorial that we will do.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Joyce, and everyone for having us.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.